Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the breaking out of violence across Kansas territory in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, known as Bleeding Kansas, and its effect on the broader national politics of the United States. So, let's dive in. So, here's our basic objectives for today. Make sure you understand and can write about these by the end, and we'll dive into our narrative. So, as we hopefully remember from last time, Kansas Territory was opened up to settlement under the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed by Stephen Douglas. This opened up the previously free territory of Kansas to the possibility of slavery through the principle of popular sovereignty. This is going to lead to a massive flood of settlement and settlers into Kansas, as people who care very strongly about the slavery issue on one side or the other rush to try to ensure that Kansas Territory is whichever direction they want it to go, is either going to be a free territory or is going to allow the owning of human beings. The pro-slavery aspect of the Kansas Territory is partially directed by Senator David Atchison, who is going to lead a significant number of pro-slavery Missourians into Kansas in order to ostensibly claim land and vote in the territorial elections and then make Kansas into a slave state. As you can see here, this is the basic description of the settlement of Kansas, so take a moment and pause and read. And in the end, what we get out of this is a pro-slavery constitution written at Constitutional Hall in Lecompton, Kansas, which is right outside of Lawrence, Kansas. And so if you ever driving along Interstate 70, you can stop and see the Territorial Constitutional Hall where the pro-slavery constitution was adopted. Investigations over this constitution revealed that there may have been a small amount of voter fraud and that the vast majority of people voting in this election were actually from Missouri, and so there was some significant controversy over the accepting of the Lecompton Constitution. President Franklin Pierce pushed for the acceptance of the Constitution, but anti-slavery forces would block this, and abolitionists from across the country would begin to rally and flood into Kansas in order to try to influence the election the other way and to stop the Lecompton Constitution from being adopted. There was also massive controversy in Congress, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And so we can see, again, the rallying and the opposition to the Lecompton Constitution and the push to overturn it or potentially come up with an alternative constitution. So as we can see here, public meetings. We get organizations in places like Lawrence in order to establish and construct pros or anti-slavery forces. And the Free State Hotel becomes a fortress for anti-slavery advocates so they can print a variety of different propaganda and have a fallback position in case they are attacked. So Topeka and Lawrence become bastions of Free State activity. Topeka draws their own constitution in 1855, which would ask for Kansas to be a free state, and the Free State Hotel becomes the sort of fortress of abolitionist activity in Lawrence, Kansas. Pro-slavery forces then decide that this needs to be eliminated, so take a minute and pause to read about the sack of Kansas, or the sack of Lawrence. The sack of Lawrence is an assault on Lawrence, Kansas, and the destruction of the Free State Hotel. This is much less bloody than, of course, Quantrell's raid, which was much later during the Civil War, but it does lead to the intimidation of Lawrencians and the destruction of the Free State Hotel and the printing presses held therein. The sack of Lawrence only had one casualty, which was a pro-slavery raider who was hit by a collapsing wall in the Free State Hotel. But the sack of Lawrence outraged abolitionists and helped galvanize opposition to the pro-slavery Lecompton Constitution. It especially fired up an abolitionist named John Brown, who had grown up in the Northeast and had a number of failed businesses before having a vision from God that it was his job to help eliminate slavery, this moral stain on the soul of America, from the country. Here he is pictured on a wall of the Kansas Capitol, demonstrating again his zeal and his central role in the beginning of the Civil War. This is an account of the Pottawatomie Massacre, which you should definitely take a moment and pause and read. The Pottawatomie Massacre was the execution of pro-slavery settlers by John Brown and his followers. They went along the Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas, pulling people from their beds and executing them in a shockingly cold-blooded manner. John Brown thought this was retribution. This was vengeance for the sack of Lawrence. But for pro-slavery advocates, of course, this is substantially crossing the line, and it's going to precipitate a much, much larger and bloodier conflict within Kansas. So take a minute here and pause to read about the flooding of weapons into Kansas territory. And so from this, we get the broader, what is called border war. This is a continuous guerrilla conflict across the entire frontier of Kansas and Missouri, with pro-slavery bushwhackers crossing into Kansas, attacking settlers, burning towns, famously burning the city of Lawrence to the ground during the Civil War, and Jayhawkers, anti-slavery or free soil advocates, crossing into Missouri and doing the same thing, using terror tactics to sow destruction and fear across the areas on the slavery side of the border. This border war, of course, precipitates this larger conflict and necessitates some type of federal response. Unfortunately, at the federal level, the rhetoric isn't any cooler, and so Charles Sumner is giving a long speech called The Crime Against Kansas, in which he's excoriating a variety of different pro-slavery forces, including an elderly senator from from South Carolina. In outrage over this, a younger representative from South Carolina decides to take matters into his own hands. Preston Brooks here proceeds to enter the Senate chamber as Sumner finishes speaking and beats him senseless with his cane, only stopping after the cane itself breaks. For anti-slavery advocates, this depicts the brutality of slave owners and of Preston Brooks in general, and leads to the growth of this new political party, the Republican Party, which we're going to talk more about momentarily. For Southerners, Preston Brooks was simply defending their honor. Both Sumner and Brooks were reelected to Congress, and Brooks was famously gifted with many, many different canes from his supporters in order to allow him to, I guess, keep beating people up for criticizing slavery. So, seems reasonable. This new Republican Party is going to be founded upon the issue of slavery. And so we see, quote, "We deny the authority of Congress, of a territorial legislation, or of any individual or association of individuals to give legal existence to slavery in any territory of the United States, while the present Constitution shall be maintained." And so we've got a series of resolutions here that Kansas should be a free state. And of course, they're tossing in a transcontinental railroad in there, because there's always a shade of Whig economic policies within the Republican Party. In 1856, the Republican Party is going to nominate the Pathfinder, John C. Fremont, who we might remember from starting the revolt in California, who's going to try to unite together a variety of different forces here and attempt to unify the Northerners in this new Republican Party. Despite the fact that all of the sort of reform Whigs are going to join the Republican Party, the core of the Republican Party is always going to be the anti-slavery forces across the North, who were galvanized by the violence in Kansas, the caning of Charles Sumner, and the general support for slavery from the federal government. You're also going to see, again, a protective tariff, a national bank, some of those pieces of Whig economic policy, but generally this Republican Party is going to be mostly about stopping the expansion of slavery and fighting against slavery. John C. Fremont is going to be challenged by two other candidates here, who we're going to get into momentarily. The Democratic Party is going to double down on a whole lot of things. You can still see, oh, look, they're still against the national bank. That's cute. And there's some issues down here about like moving into the Gulf of Mexico and filibustering and stuff like that. But really the most important thing is the all-caps shouting in the middle, which lays out the principle that the Democratic Party is for supporting slavery and preventing anyone from interfering with slavery expanding or with slavery in general. They're going to use this in order to use racist appeals to convince people to vote for Democrats. I mean, honestly, it's pretty straightforward here. Here's the Democratic platform and their nominee, James Buchanan, being just the platform for a Southern slave owner. And then you've got our third candidate, Millard Fillmore. My favorite part of this is that, quote, "The Whig Party has no new principles to announce, no new platform to establish, but are content to broadly rest where their fathers have rested upon the Constitution of the United States. And we regard with deepest anxiety the present disordered condition of our national affairs." So, that's cute. Millard Fillmore running as a Whig/Know-Nothing is clearly going to play some sort of spoiler, and because the Whigs and the Know-Nothings are much stronger in the North, it's likely going to spoil the Republican Party. Everyone knew this at the time, and it was pretty clear that that was what was going to happen, and of course, as you can see in 1856, that's exactly what happens. Despite winning only 45% of the popular vote, James Buchanan wins because a lot of the border states were spoiled and because he has universal support throughout the South. The Northern and Whig vote together is going to account for about 55% of the popular vote, but Millard Fillmore is only going to win one state. And so this Republican ticket, it shows potential in that if Northerners and anti-slavery advocates can find a candidate who can unite all of them, you can win the presidency without getting any support from the South. But finding that person and finding those issues that can unite those people are going to be very complicated. So this brings us to the presidency of James Buchanan. James Buchanan was never married and was our only president who has never been married. He was from Pennsylvania, and he became enamored with Southern culture because of his very close friendship with his roommate, Rufus King. And so he is going to fight strongly to support Southern interest because of his affinity for Rufus. The most outrageous example of this is, of course, the Dred Scott decision. The Dred Scott decision is a very complicated case, and I'm not going to go into all the details of Dred Scott changing owners and all this other stuff. But what you need to know about Dred Scott is that he was an enslaved person who was brought by an army officer first into Illinois and then later into Minnesota Territory, or I guess it was Wisconsin Territory at the time. Dred Scott then sued, arguing that his living in free states and free territories for a significant portion of his life meant that he should no longer be held in bondage because as slavery was outlawed in these areas, how could he possibly be enslaved? James Buchanan leaned strongly on the Supreme Court, not just to deny Dred Scott his freedom, but to establish this principle, which is stated so eloquently by Roger B. Taney, Supreme Court Justice, who says, quote, "We think people of African ancestry are not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the words citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges which the instrument provides for and secures to citizens of the United States." So not only does Dred Scott not become free, but the Supreme Court has now established that Black people are not citizens and have no constitutional rights or protections. So now, the only way to get rid of that is another Supreme Court ruling or a constitutional amendment. And as a number of people have pointed out, this potentially could invalidate the entire principle of free states, because now legally you can take enslaved people into free territory and they don't become free. So is any territory actually free at this point? This is clearly an issue that we're going to have to settle at some point, possibly by a massive civil war. So we'll leave off for there, and tomorrow we'll start the Civil War. Thank you for listening.